Hello, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Manns, and I'd like to welcome you to the April 4th Coalition Show. This is December 5th, 2022 edition of the show, and it's been 431 weeks since the closing of the North Adams Regional Hospital. The April 4th Coalition's mission statement is, "We are for workers' rights and collective bargaining rights and are against tax breaks for the rich and corporations who ship our jobs overseas." We support all the articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but as is our custom at the start of the show, we put the emphasis on Article 23. And I'm going to do 1 and 2, and Dick has 3 and 4 this week. So, number 1, everyone has the right to work, to free choice of employment, to just and favorable conditions of work, and protection against unemployment. Number 2, everyone without any discrimination has the right to equal pay for equal work.
Number 3, everyone who works has the right to just and favorable remuneration, ensuring for himself and his family and her family an existence worthy of human dignity and supplemented, if necessary, by other means of social protection. Number 4, everyone has the right to join and form trade unions for the protection of his or her interests.
Yep. And last week, last Friday, Congress took an important vote on the railroad strike.
Right,
and
they decided
that we semi-disagree with, I suspect.
Right. They decided to force the contract that some of the unions had rejected. Congress, through an act of Congress, and the key sticking point was sick leave. But we have Bernie Sanders speaking on the issue prior to the vote, and we thought it'd be really important for you to hear what he has to say on it, because I think he does us a lot of justice. And me, having my grandfather and father having worked on the railroad.
My father being a teacher, being active in the unions, besides us both being union employee members.
So why don't we listen to what Bernie has to say to the Congress? It sort of jumps in the middle of it. I'm sorry about that, but he's been introduced. He introduced himself, and he's talking about the issues facing the country at this time.
Society, they see corporate profits soaring while the prices they pay for the products they need continue to go up. They see CEOs of major corporations now making 400 times more than the average worker at that corporation. They have seen during this terrible pandemic, when tens of thousands of workers died because they had to go to work, they have seen the billionaire class make $2 trillion more in their wealth. Further, they look around them, and while the very wealthiest people in America become much richer, they walk down the street and they see people sleeping out on the sidewalks. We got almost 600,000 Americans who are homeless. People can't afford their health care costs. We had 85 million Americans who are uninsured or underinsured. In other words, the economy is doing really, really, really well for CEOs and billionaires. But for the average American worker, he or she is falling further and further behind. Now, within that broad context of what's happening in the overall economy, let's take a look at what is going on in the rail industry today and why Congress is being asked to implement a union contract with rail workers to avoid a strike that could take place as early as December 9th. And it turns out that when we talk about the extraordinary level of corporate greed in America, there is no better example of that than what is taking place in the rail industry today. They are the purest example of why the American people are so angry at what's taking place in our economy. So if you look at the rail industry today, what you will understand is that this industry has seen huge record-breaking profits in recent years. Huge profits. In fact, in the first 3 quarters, not a whole year, 3 quarters of this year, the rail industry made a record-breaking $21 billion in profit. Further, they have so much money, profits are so high, that the industry spent over $25 billion this year not to improve rail safety, not to address the supply chain crisis, but to buy back its own stock and hand out huge dividends to its wealthy stockholders. In fact, since 2010, and I hope every member of Congress hears this, the rail industry has spent over $183 billion on stock buybacks and dividends. And on top of all of that, the CEOs of many of these railroad companies are enjoying huge compensation packages. So while workers struggle, last year the CEO of CSX made over $20 million in total compensation. The CEO of Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern made over $14 million each in total compensation. In other words, within the rail industry, corporate profits are soaring and CEOs are making incredibly large compensation packages. But in the midst of all of that, it is fair to ask what is going on for workers. Profits record-breaking, CEOs tens of millions of dollars a year in compensation. What's going on for the workers in the rail industry? And the reality is that the key issue in the rail dispute that we are dealing with right now, votes taking place as we speak in the House, is not about salary. It's not about how much money workers there are earning. The key issue is the working conditions in the rail industry, which are absolutely unacceptable and literally beyond belief. Right now, if you work in the freight rail industry, and this is a job in the rail industry, this is really hard work, dangerous work. It's work that takes place when it's 20 below zero. If you are a worker in the rail freight industry, you are entitled to a grand total of 0 sick days. Let me repeat that. You are entitled to a grand total of 0 sick days. Now, as a nation, industry after industry, government after government here in Congress, our people get sick. They have the right to take time off. It's humane. Nobody, not the most conservative member of this institution, would say to a worker, oh, you got COVID, you're fired. It would be unthinkable. And yet, what this means, the policy in the rail industry means, is if you get sick, if your child gets sick, if your spouse gets sick and you need to take time off of work, not only will you not get paid, you actually will get reprimanded and could get fired. And that absurd, inhumane situation is precisely what is taking place today in the rail industry. Mr. President, let me remind you and all of our colleagues that hundreds of Americans are still dying every day from COVID, and tens of thousands are being hospitalized as a result of this terrible virus. What the freight rail industry is saying to its workers is this: it doesn't matter if you have COVID, it doesn't matter if you are lying in a hospital bed because of a medical emergency, it doesn't matter if your wife has just given birth, it just doesn't matter. If you do not come into work, no matter what the reason, we have the right to punish you, we have the right to fire you. Frankly, it is hard to believe that these conditions still exist in the United States of America in the year 2022. Let me give you just a few examples that I am familiar with hearing from workers. One rail worker was penalized by the railroads for spending the day in the hospital with his son, who was having breathing issues. Another worker couldn't take his pregnant wife to the doctor because it could have resulted in disciplinary action for him. Tragically, we witnessed the death of a locomotive engineer who was forced to skip his doctor's appointment after experiencing unusual symptoms, only to suffer a heart attack and die in an engine room weeks later. And here is what one rail worker recently said, and I quote, "I am tired of being tired all day, every day, and having every one of my coworkers being physically sick from sleep deprivation. Most of my coworkers can't stay awake anymore during a 12-hour trip," end of quote. That's one rail worker. Mr. President, there is absolutely no reason why these workers should have to deal with these conditions in the richest country in the history of the world. And I wonder, Mr. President, if the CEOs in the railroad industry or other top executives in this industry, I wonder if they get fired when they don't get into the office because of sickness or when they have a medical emergency in their families. So I think in fact, the head of the Teamsters recently said this, Sean O'Brien, that, what's good for the CEOs in terms of paid sick leave is good for employees as well, and I think he is absolutely right. Further, I should add, as everybody knows, that quite sensibly the federal government guarantees 12 weeks of paid family and medical leave to its workers. So if you are an employee, for example, at the Department of Transportation in the United States of America, sitting behind the desk, you are appropriately guaranteed 12 weeks of paid family and medical leave. But if you are an engineer running a train with tons of freight behind you, you get 0 sick time. Now, that may make sense to somebody, but it does not make sense to me. As a result of this incredibly reactionary policy of denying workers sick time, rail conductors, engineers, and other rail employees are coming into work sick and exhausted, which is a danger not only to themselves, but to their co-workers and everyone else who is around them. The work they do is dangerous work. Mr. President, the United States, sadly, is the only major country on earth that does not guarantee paid sick days, something that we hope to remedy. We tried to remedy, and we've got to continue going forward so that we do remedy it. It is a bit of an embarrassment that of all the major countries on earth, we are the only one not to guarantee paid sick days. In Germany, workers are entitled to as many as 84 weeks of paid sick leave at 70% of their salary, depending upon how serious the illness is. And countries all over the world, in one way or another, have generous policies that recognize that in a modern, civilized society, if you get sick, if your kids get sick, if your wife or husband gets sick, you are entitled as a worker to have paid sick leave. But while government workers here in the United States and in many, many industries, many companies, guarantee their workers paid sick leave, rail workers in the United States of America today, in the year 2022, are guaranteed 0 paid sick days, 0. Now, the rail industry has told us that they can't afford to provide paid sick days to their employees. Instead of sitting down and negotiating with their unions to bring about a reasonable compromise, For the past 3 years, the rail industry has refused to agree to a single day of guaranteed paid sick leave to its workers. They say it would cost too much money to provide their workers any paid sick days. Well, let's see. They made over $21 billion in profits so far this year. They provide their CEOs with huge compensation packages. They spent $25.5 billion to buy back their own stock and hand out huge dividends to their wealthy stockholders. But they are just too broke, too financially hard-pressed to guarantee paid sick days to their employees. So here is where we are, Mr. President. Interestingly enough, it turns out that guaranteeing 7 paid sick days to rail workers would cost the industry a grand total of $321 million a year, a tiny fraction of the $21 billion in profits that they have already made. If the major rail carriers can afford to spend $25.5 billion a year on stock buybacks and dividends, do not tell me that they cannot afford to guarantee paid sick days to their workers and allow these workers to have a reasonable quality of life. Mr. President, the outrage over the lack of paid sick leave is not the only issue that rail workers in America have been fighting for. The rail workers of this country are sick and tired of unreliable scheduling, which is having a negative impact on their personal and family lives. In America today, rail workers are on call for up to 14 consecutive days, 12 hours a day. In fact, it is not uncommon for many rail workers to be on call nearly 24 hours a day with a requirement to report to work within 90 minutes for shifts that can last nearly 80 hours. Now, Mr. President, as you know, last September, President Biden and Labor Secretary Walsh worked with the rail industry and union leaders to come up with a tentative agreement that was better than what the rail industry had been offering. But this agreement still does not require the industry to provide a single day of paid sick leave to workers. I thank President Biden and Secretary Walsh for their efforts, but Congress can and must do better. And that is why I will be introducing legislation to guarantee paid sick days to every rail worker in America. And I will insist on a roll call vote in the Senate on this legislation as part of any unanimous consent required to vote on the tentative rail deal. Now, Mr. President, I hope very much, and I think we may, have bipartisan support for this modest legislation. And I would hope, and I've talked to Republicans who indicate that they are prepared to support the workers, but I would say to every member of this body, Democrat, Republican, that think long and hard about how you go home to your constituents and say, I voted against allowing rail workers in this country 7 paid sick days. Go home and think about how you're going to explain that vote. And Mr. President, let's be clear. It's not just the rail unions and Bernie Sanders who believe that working conditions on the railroads with no guaranteed sick leave is wrong and inhumane. It turns out that that view is shared by some of the railroad's major business customers who are seeing a decline in the service that they are receiving and that they need. Let me quote from a recent op-ed by Eric Beyer, the president and CEO of the National Association of Chemical Distributors who wrote an op-ed entitled, "Railroads Should Give Workers the Benefits They Seek." And here's what Mr. Bayer wrote. And again, this is a business organization that wants to make sure that their product is delivered on the railroads in a reasonable period of time and on schedule. And Mr. Bayer writes, quote, "To say the paid sick leave policy for rail workers is woefully inadequate would be an understatement. The negotiated agreement does not include any significant measures to improve quality of life issues. Rail workers today have zero time allotted to them by their freight rail employers for sick leave. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, private sector workers receive 7 to 8 days of sick leave per year. A fragile and volatile supply chain requires a strong rail network. Now is not the time to deny reasonable benefits for a labor community that has been decimated by losses in recent years. It's time for the freight industry to right this wrong and get rail back on track," end of quote. That's from the chemical distributors, an important customer of the railroads. And it's not just the chemical distributors. And I want people to hear what the chairman of the Surface Transportation Board, Martin Oberman, had to say about the horrendous working conditions in the rail industry at a conference with rail executives earlier this month. And here is what Mr. Oberman said, quote, "When railroads try to excuse their failures by pointing to labor shortages at other businesses, those other businesses did not enter the pandemic having stripped themselves of nearly 20% of their workforce in recent years. Today, the railroads tell us they are still having a hard time recruiting and retaining workers and try to blame this on the Great Resignation. The fact is the railroads' personnel practices made these jobs much less desirable," end of quote. According to Mr. Oberman, the railroad industry has slashed its workforce by 10% since the pandemic started, slashing some 13,000 jobs. And he continued, again, this is Mr. Oberman saying, quote, "Class 1 rail companies over the past 2.5 years saved roughly $4.8 billion in payroll. During the same 2.5 years, the Class 1 rail companies have returned nearly $60 billion to stockholders in stock buybacks and dividends, more than 12 times what they saved in payroll. Might the shareholders have been satisfied with only $55 billion in buybacks and dividends? Apparently not. $4.8 billion in saved payroll, but the operating ratio had to be met," end of quote. But what he is saying, and what I think many of us understand, is the railroads are making huge profits. They have seen their profit margins nearly triple over the past 20 years, and during the last 6 years, they have reduced their workforce by 30%. You want to make more money? That's the way you do it. You cut back on your workforce. And now they are in a situation where they're telling workers, if you get COVID, you're going to get fired. So clearly we need to rethink the entire business model of the rail industry. But right now, the issue before us is not complicated. And that is that in an industry which is enjoying record-breaking profits, an industry which laid off 30% of its workforce in the last 6 years, an industry which gives its CEOs huge compensation packages, now is the time for that industry to respect its workers and treat them with the dignity that all working people are entitled to. So, Mr. President, we are in an important moment, not just for the rail industry, not only for rail workers. The issue is whether or not this United States Senate will join the House, and my understanding is that the House just passed paid sick leave, 7 days. They did the right thing, and I want to applaud the members of the House for doing the right thing. and now it's going to come here to the Senate. Do we stand with workers in the rail industry and say, yes, you are right. Working conditions are horrendous. We cannot continue a process by which you have zero paid sick leave. Do we stand with workers, or do we stand with an industry that is making huge profits, pays its CEOs exorbitant salaries, and treats its workers with contempt? That's the choice that this Senate will soon be having to make. And I hope very much that in a bipartisan way we can do the right thing and tell the rail workers and tell every worker in America that the United States Congress is prepared to stand with them, people on top who are doing extraordinarily well. And with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor.
Here we go.
Well,
Well,
that was quite a speech.
it was quite a speech. It reminds you of the Jimmy Stewart days and filibustering.
Yeah.
But, but he's entirely correct. Paid sick leave is a given in so many industries that it shouldn't be.
Every worker deserves
Deserves it. And it would be great if we had universal health care to go with it, but
Yes.
one step at a time, I guess.
Yeah. We fell short.
The Senate fell short, and I'm sure he's introduced the bill.
Yeah. They'll revisit it.
I'm sure.
It. Now, we don't know how much time we have left.
So
So,
I'm hoping that we're going to be.
3 minutes.
We have 3 minutes? Oh, good. Thank
all
you.
right, good. I just,
Because I know he's got an article he wanted to discuss too.
well, there was,
While we're waiting for that, and it's sad because it's so uneven across this country with all things, and even the 12-hour shift and the 24 being on call for like 14 days,
yeah.
and having to have to do 12-hour shifts
Right,
every
and
time
just one
at
person
least,
on a train,
and one person. It's
We
a
covered
recipe for an
We covered
accident.
this when the strike first occurred.
Yeah,
Um,
it's a recipe for a major accident to happen.
Yeah. And this is industry-wide. I mean, it's very necessary. I mean, if you look at those trains that go by, they're carrying things, sulfuric acid.
They are.
They're carrying things that are very harmful.
And
if
toxic. Yeah.
something could go wrong. So, it's incomprehensible that they would not provide sick leave and sick days. And we should
And a
provide
fixed schedule.
Everyone should be.
And hire back people so
Right.
that they can provide a fixed schedule. I mean,
If you
as much as
treat people
possible.
well, they'll want to have the job. It's not just about the money. People want free time.
They do.
That's the part of, that's part of.
I mean, you work to provide for your family, but what's the point if you don't have time to spend with the
Right.
family?
You need
You're
to
like a
have,
ghost.
ensure for him or herself and his or her family an existence worthy of human dignity and supplement it if necessary. But that human dignity, that, you
Right.
have the right, if you have a loved one or someone that needs your help,
Mm-hmm.
you need to take the time off, not being threatened to be fired.
Right.
And this is
This is a throwback to the 1880s when
Right.
none of that
And
existed.
when you treat workers that way, they end up voting for people who, they get used to dictatorship, and they want dictators, and they because they don't see anybody providing them with any
Anything.
democratic.
Any benefits. They don't see you fighting for them.
Right.
And that dictator sure sounds good.
Yeah, because at least he talks to us. So we need to really step forward, and I think that Congress will do that. I think that the power will be given back to the people
On that
and-
one.
on this issue. I think the president wants it, and I think Congress will
Smart.
revisit this.
And we know that President Biden and Marty Walsh tried to get it in there, but I gather the CEO stood firm on this one, and he was staring on a national crisis of, the food chain and everything
Yeah.
else. And
I don't know. I think
it was
that-
a devil's choice, I guess.
Well, let's hope that, the rail workers can get back to work, but be having a safe working environment. Not one where they put their life in jeopardy every day,
Correct.
you know, so.
So I guess I'm hoping we're able to approach the end of the show and say power to the people.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
There's power in the factory, power in the land, power in the hand of the worker. But it all amounts to nothing if together we don't stand. There is power in our union. Now the lessons of the past were all learned with workers' blood. Mistakes of the bosses we must pay for. From the cities and the farmlands to trenches.